Ready when you are, yep. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad you could join us this afternoon for our panel on Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop gaming and representation. I'm Nick Galante. I'm one of the librarians here at Cedar Crest College. With me today, helping me out with the technical aspects, my co-host, Nicole Rivera. You are, yep. Also with us are our other panelists, Elizabeth Ortiz, Professor of Communications here at Cedar Crest. Hello, everyone. And our special guest, Aaron Trammell. Joining us this afternoon for our panel on Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop gaming and representation. I'm Nick Galante. I'm one of the librarians here at Cedar Crest College. With me today, helping me. What we'll start to do is I've introduced you guys, but we'll just go around and introduce ourselves, talk a little about what our background is and what we're bringing to this conversation. So, as I said, I'm one of the librarians here. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for the last 5-6 years, and I'm also an English professor at Cressman Community College. And I'm interested in fantasy and the importance of. Okay. I'm just being reminded that Nicole has to manually switch between the different speakers, so there may be a slight delay. So apologies to both our co-panelists and anybody watching. This may be. If this is a little unpolished, we apologize, but you should be able to hear everybody who's speaking, and we'll try to keep the camera on whoever is talking at the moment. So, Nicole, do you want to do an intro, or are you happy just being in the shadows here?
I guess I'll do an intro, so I'll switch myself in. It is weird. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole. I am the Lending Services Coordinator here at Cedar Crest College. A lot of the faculty may remember me as a student, but I am now promoted and am staff. I have been here for, going on 9 years now. So I will now switch it over to Liz.
Liz, you should see a little red. Yep, there you go.
Perfect. Wow, I really like this control that you have, Nicole. This is very cool. In a time when we're talking about gaming and representation and women in part, right? You have control of all of our microphones, so that's something pretty cool. So thank you for having me here. I've been at Cedar Crest for 18 years in communication, and my research looks closely at representation in media. And so while gaming is an area that I'm actually relatively new to, I think I've learned more from my own children about gaming than my personal experience. Right now, if at any moment you hear screaming, it's because they have some of their buddies over and they're all masked and yelling to each other and playing games, on the Switch. And so I'm excited to be here, excited to share this space, Nick, with you and Nicole, who have, really, I think, started us off on such a great foot with all the prep that you gave us, and really excited to be here with Aaron as a gaming scholar, and reading his work over the past few days and weeks has been really exciting. So, Friday afternoon panel might sound like a tough time, but my gosh, definitely extremely cool to be together in this group. Oh, I think I just saw that Aaron said he's going to be right back because he's having some technical difficulties.
Yeah.
So we'll give him a second to jump back in.
But yeah, as actually I can kind of fill the space here, wait for him to get back. As you said, Liz, this is part of an ongoing thing that Nicole and I have been doing for the last several months here at Cedar Crest. Some of you that are tuning in right now might be aware that over the last several weeks we've had a couple of Dungeons and Dragons nights here in the library. It's part of a larger effort that we're going to be making, partially in this semester, but hopefully much more so in the fall semester when people are vaccinated and we can actually gather more regularly. And it's just going to be part of a bunch of different events that we want to do here in the library to, not just be a part of the conversation that we're having here, but just get people in the college more involved in the library here in the building, more familiar with just what we do here. So this is the first of these kinds of panels that we're doing, but hopefully it will not be the last. I see that. Thank you, Nicole. So Aaron is back with us, so we'll pass it over to him. He can do his little introduction. Aaron, you are muted.
Yeah, I muted you because there was back.
Gotcha.
Hi, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here. Apologies about that. I sorted out the technical difficulties just in the nick of time. Yeah, my name is Aaron Trammell, and I'm an assistant professor at UC Irvine in the Department of Informatics and also core faculty in the Department of Visual Studies. And my work is on games and game studies, and specifically, I focus on two things. So I tried to look at what I call analog games, which is like a sort of umbrella term for anything from board games to tabletop role-playing games to live-action role-playing games to even like performance art and performance games, things that don't happen in digital spaces. So I usually study and analyze analog games, specifically games like Dungeons and Dragons. But often when I analyze them, I look at them through the lens of critical race and gender studies. So I often try to bring in a bunch of critical tools to understand how things like race, class, and gender are presented in the games I look at. So that's kind of where my research lies, and I'm just so excited to talk to this group today about Dungeons and Dragons, because like, I don't know, growing up in the 90s and 80s and playing Dungeons and Dragons and having it be like as a kid that sort of game that gave me a lot of identity, let me feel like I could make friends and live these like fantastic lives. It's just exciting to see how that game has bloomed and grown today, and how they've tried to really pull in, edit out some of the more tips kept back in the day. So just thrilled to be here and looking forward.
And Aaron, you're just a note. I don't know if it was the same for everybody else, but you were cutting in and out there toward the end. So just maybe just speak up a little bit so make sure everybody can hear everything you're saying. But we're really thrilled to have you. We're glad you could be a part of this. And Liz, even though we're glad to have you on board as well. We're hoping that even though you're not as versed in this universe as we are, you can your expertise will give some interesting perspective on this.
Hey Nick, you got to know I'm geeking out over here because you know, analog games as Aaron described them is really a space that I pay so much attention to. But also critical race theory and gender studies is really at the core of everything I do here at Cedar Crest. So if I wasn't already excited to be here today, it's like just ratcheted it up even more.
Awesome, glad to hear it. So as Aaron said, like Dungeons and Dragons has a sort of rocky history. Would you say it's a fair assessment, Aaron, with the way it's discussed, like representation and of race and gender and different cultures?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's the sad truth is that the representation in the game definitely did not start off on the right foot. I've counted, you know, like images in the very early manuals and stuff like that, and you know, there's almost no Black, brown, or indigenous people represented in any of the early manuals. And also representations of women in those early periods are like extraordinarily sexualized, right? Like, so if there's a woman, she's probably in like a leather bikini or something like that. So yeah, the early history of Dungeons and Dragons is quite fraught. Yeah, I think we're here today to kind of think through what's happening there, what's changed, and why, you know, the game and how the game has adapted to new audiences. Yeah, I can build out on that if you have more specific questions, but I want to make sure that I let the conversation breathe, because I get excited and I'll just like go for like 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that one of the things that kind of was the catalyst for what became this talk was an article that we shared on social media about that history, about that very like rocky history. Which I know both of you have read, Nicole and I have read it from Wired, talking about how D&D perpetuates the sort of racist, sexist, problematic stereotypes of generations, partially from larger cultural ideas and stereotypes, but also stuff that's been prevalent in fantasy for decades, dating back to Tolkien and maybe even beyond.
Yeah.
And how there is an effort to change that, and there is an effort to make that better. And we can talk more about that later, but I think just sort of a general overview. And Liz, I'm sure you will have a lot to say on this as well, especially, but the idea of inclusion. It's a word that's tossed around a lot. People are always talking about making things more inclusive, more representative, more diverse, and that can ruffle feathers sometimes. But so I guess the first thing we should start with is, why is that so important? Why are we doing this? Why are we trying so hard to change things that have been around for almost a century? Why are we messing with Tolkien? If he's the godfather of fantasy, why are we messing with that? What's the end goal?
Yeah, I think you got right to the crux of it, right? There's some of this, sense of nostalgia, and this is the way it's always been played, and this is what we've always done. I mean, you hear the same thing about mediated representations on television, for example, or in movies. But, from what I was reading and what I'm seeing, and y'all can let me know, but it seems like a lot of the fans are pushing for this too. It's not just something that's coming externally, right? It's not just people on the outside looking in saying you need to change what's happening in this space, but fans who loved it and grew up with it, reading, Erin, your one piece about being 10 years old and having your new encyclopedia and, paging through it. I mean, these are people who have grown up with this game. These are people who love it and love it even through its flaws, but who now see those flaws, right? And they're becoming more in tune with who they are and with who the culture is. So I was really interested in that. This was coming, the calls coming from inside the house, right? Like, people are in there wanting things to shift, wanting things to change. This is not, outside folks coming in, because I don't even know if outside folks really understand the whole environment as it is. So I don't know. Did you all see that as well? That it's people who love it, who are asking for it to become better, to become more?
Yeah, I'd love to respond to that. So I think you put your finger on it, Elizabeth, because basically with the history of Dungeons and Dragons and the way that they basically branded things up through about 1989, 88, they had, I'm sorry, those years are incorrect, but up through the mid 80s, the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons was run by TSR Hobbies, which at that point was led by Gary Gygax in a variety of different mutations. And then in the mid 80s, the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons came out. And at this point, there was a new CEO of TSR Hobbies. Gygax had been ousted. He was upset about that. But they brought in second edition Dungeons and Dragons, where they tried to market it to a more family audience, because also they were dealing with a lot of the backlash at the time from what Dungeons and Dragons people called the Satanic Panics, where people thought you'd open up your Dungeons and Dragons book, you'd see a devil, and then suddenly you'd start worshiping Satan or something like that in the games you'd play. So that happened. So they kind of pivoted to a more family-friendly look. But that pivot, right, it's family friendly in the way that we would imagine family friendly in the 1980s, right? It's very 1980s Reagan America in that context. So it's not necessarily an inclusive vision of family that brought in all sorts of different people. It's still predominantly white folks and predominantly men featured in the pages of Dungeons and Dragons. And when there were women, they were still very sexualized, but at least it was trying to be a little more family friendly in that way. In the mid-90s, I'm just giving you a brief historical overview of some of these changes that happened over time. In the mid-90s, Wizards of the Coast, which had made a ton of money selling Magic the Gathering cards, acquired Dungeons and Dragons as a brand, and then they put out around the year 2000 the third edition of Dungeons and Dragons, where things started to modernize a little at this period. And the big thing that happened with third edition was they let anybody make supplements for the game. So anybody who wanted to be a Dungeons and Dragons module designer could invent a module and write it. And so fans were writing all sorts of things. So there's this explosion of creativity that happens in the early aughts around Dungeons and Dragons. And then, and here's where the fans really take over, they came out with 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons around 2008, 2009. And this was not a very well-received edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The fans did not like it, and instead they started playing, and also Wizards of the Coast cracked down on the intellectual property and said, please don't modify this game anymore. So the fans started modifying a similar game to 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons called Pathfinder, the role-playing game. And what happened with Pathfinder was, at this point, because the fans were then in charge of writing the game, they started bringing in people with different sexual orientations, foregrounding women, foregrounding people of color in a lot of the stories that the game told. And Wizards of the Coast, which was wondering why Dungeons & Dragons sales were floundering at the moment, started doing panels at like Comic-Con, at Gen Con, asking people, why are you buying Pathfinder and not Dungeons & Dragons? And they heard from the fans, it's because we want this more inclusive game that Pathfinder let us do. And so the designers, Mike Merrills and Chris Crawford of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, took all that feedback into account, did a humongous playtesting campaign to try to make it a more inclusive product, and really tried to foreground in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, women and people of color, people for a variety of body types, in the artwork of the game itself, and in the rules allowing for different senses of cultural diversity as you played the game, right? Like there's a rule that's like your character might be an archetype, but that doesn't mean that you can't move against your archetype in these ways, and that's interesting storytelling. So they put that explicitly in the rules of 5th edition, and that's kind of where we are now, right? We're 7 years into 5th edition, and it is exploded with all this different representational qualities and different representational people in the game, and it's kind of really exciting to just see this new generation of people coming up with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and how exciting that is. And yeah, to your point, Elizabeth, it's all fans who kind of push that forward. I don't think it would have happened otherwise.
Yeah, and it's worth. I think it's worth mentioning that in a supplement that is going to be coming out, I think next month, something that fans have had an issue with for a long time is the word race. The games use the word race to describe different playable, humanoid creatures, whether you're human or elf or orc or centaur or any of the there's 40 some races at this point in the game, and despite the fact that the word is not used in the context that we're used to hearing it, people had there was this really strong opposition to the use of the word, that it sort of was sanctioning this otherness that we're all used to seeing and hearing when we associate with the word race. So just in the most recent supplement, Wizards announced that they're going to be doing away with the word entirely. The different creatures that are playable as a player character are now going to be referred to as heritage. It's heritage, right, Nicole? Sound right?
It's actually lineage.
Lineage. Thank you.
And we do have a question in the chat, just so you know.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I was on the chat, not the Q&A. There it is. Yes, we've gotten our first question. So Audrey Ettinger is asking, I'm wondering if there's any relationship with D&D players growing up and having spouses and children who might not play the game. Of course, I'm thinking of this because my spouse wouldn't have recognized the sexism as problematic as a teenager, but certainly would now. Oh dear. Our motion sensors have, there we go. The perils of being
I know that symbol.
I think that this added to our conversation.
Yeah.
Who would like to answer the question first?
Well, I think, Aaron, you talk about that a little bit in one of your pieces, that kind of growing up with the game. So I think Aaron, you're a good fit. And Dr. Ettinger is one of our science faculty. There's a number of faculty from the college that have jumped on today, which is really cool. So yeah, she hears from me a lot. So why don't you take that one, Aaron?
Thank you for the wonderful question. Yeah, I definitely think there is a generational aspect to the story of change here. So yeah, not right, like that. As people get older, and you have kids and you have friends from a variety of different subject positions. I get that's jargon. So different places in the world, right? I definitely think that you become more sympathetic to the experiences of others in a variety of different ways, or at least ideally, you become more sympathetic to the experiences of others in a variety of different ways. So I definitely think that's part of it. And like, you know, getting into the article that Elizabeth was referring to, you know, growing up with Dungeons and Dragons, and thinking about where I was as a kid and what I valued as a kid, and you know, all the sorts of like macho cultural media I was consuming all the time, right? I think there's something to be said also just for the way that race, class, and gender are interrogated in the media today versus the way they were interrogated in the media in the 80s and 90s, where back then it was a lot more uncritical, and you know, people were often willing to let things slide then when they wouldn't be so willing to let things slide now. And you know, I think in that way we're all growing up and we're all growing into this game that's becoming a cultural product that's shared. The brand itself is in some ways more famous than the game itself. Right, everybody knows what Dungeons and Dragons is, even if they haven't played it. Everybody feels like they could play Dungeons and Dragons even if they haven't played it. And I think that's really a big part of that story is, you know, everybody just kind of growing into that brand over time, and yeah, growing up also to be a little more critical of it as we look back on it. But Elizabeth, I'm really curious what you have to say about this.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I think that we probably grew up, you know, within probably an hour or two of each other, Aaron, probably during the same time period. I think just trying to place where you were when I was reading your work, and I grew up here in Pennsylvania, just, you know, 20 minutes from Jersey. And I think so much of what you're saying about that 80s, 90s media, you know, was right. We just didn't really question it. It didn't always feel right. Right. We kind of knew like some of these representations were a little strange, or, you know, I'm not seeing, for example, growing up as a Latina, thinking like, where are all the Latinas in the media? You know, they are fast talking, they have broken accents, they are maids, they are, you know, all of these roles that they played, and they definitely weren't present in a lot of gaming unless they were, you know, the women who were scantily clad on the side of the game, you know, when a car raced past them or something. Like, you know, I mean, we really didn't see a lot of representation in that space. But I think, you know, students now are so much more aware of it than I think I was at that time. And I think that is because, you know, we were uncritical. Like you said, we maybe didn't have the lens or the framework, or maybe it was growing up like in that post-Reagan era, when anything after Reagan felt inclusive and, you know, less problematic. But yeah, I think, you know, TV was modeling that in many of the same ways. We'd have a few families, a few Black families, for example, right? But they were still really cast, I think, in very much, you know, this masculine-led culture. You know, everything kind of fit. They may have been Black characters or Black actors, but so many of the frames were those that we were used to seeing in a lot of the white sitcoms or a lot of the white comedies as well. So it was a skin tone change, but not necessarily a real critique or a real look at the realities of, for example, Black and African Americans in the U.S. in the 80s and 90s.
I think actually that could be a good segue into one of the other topics that I wanted to bring up, and sort of the role of tabletop gaming and analog gaming, as you called it, Aaron. But especially games like Dungeons and Dragons, like Pathfinder, where you have the agency to create your own character, and like the aspects of like power fantasy and identity and personal aspiration that comes into play. Like, do you think like you said even growing up there, the representation wasn't there, but do you think people were drawn to D&D because they could break those stereotypes, because they could be a sort of aspirational version of themselves that they weren't seeing in media?
I love that question. So I think there's two things that happen in a role-playing game that come together, and there's like a kind of magic that happens in the intersection. And I know when I started kind of researching this topic, I think I leaned a little too heavily into one of the two kinds of things, and I'm trying to embrace the other side of it now, which is the role-playing side, which is, I think, the question that you have, right? Like, what does it mean to play a role? More than just the...
Hang on one second, Aaron. Looks like, are we still on me? Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure people could see you as well as hear you. Yes, I see that. I will get to that in a moment. So, Aaron, you're on. Sorry to interrupt.
So, yeah, there's two things that happen in a role-playing game, right? So there's the game, which is a bunch of rules and books that tell you what happens, when to roll your dice, what your character is, what your character does. And then there's the play, which is, I think, the sort of embodied part, right? Which is like, what does it mean to engage and interact with the game? In some ways, the cultural dynamics also are in the play, right? Because we have cultures of play. We have representations within games which are produced culturally also, but that's not necessarily culture itself. And so I think to your question, right, like, what is that experience? Is it empowering? Does it let people see themselves in a different way? For sure, I think some people do see themselves in a different way when they play a role-playing game. Now, I think in some ways, though, you hit up against the bars of the game rule. And this is just me kind of theorizing, right? Like, if you're out there and you've had a different experience playing a game, that's legit. I don't want to take that away. But I think for a lot of people, when they see a rule and they see, like, the example I used in one of the things I wrote was like a demi-human, a dwarf, can't rise to a level above level 12 in some editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think when you see that rule as a player, that encourages you to interpret that game world in a particular way. You then know, inhabiting that game world, that there's fundamental differences between things in that game world. And, although it might be empowering to be a human in that context, it might not be so empowering to be a dwarf or an elf or a gnome or any of the demi-human races. And I think that's really where you see these things like race and gender come into the game. I'll give another example, right? Like, when some fans were originally producing rules for gender and trying to think through what it means to play a lady or a man in Dungeons and Dragons, they just said, like, oh, well, we know women are less strong than men, because they knew that from popular media and from stereotypes that circulate in the world. And then they just said, okay, well, +1 to strength, -1 to dexterity for men, +1 to dexterity, -1 to strength for women. And, that was their way of trying to represent that. And you can see that in other video games like Gauntlet at the time, right, where, like, there's the agile Valkyrie versus, like, the strong warrior. That was a very typical way that gender was represented in games. And I think that that's always what's happening, is that players are negotiating those rules and trying to make sense out of them as they play the game. And I think to Nicole's wonderful point, and your wonderful point earlier, where you were both talking about heritage and lineage in games, right? Like, finding different ways to sculpt that vocabulary allows players to imagine themselves differently in these games, right? And imagine things like empowerment or access to the game world differently. So I think that would be my long answer to a short question.
I do want to jump in quick, Liz. I don't know if you want to answer something, but I do want to make a quick mention. The article that you referenced, Aaron, yours on gender in gaming, is, if anybody wants an interesting read, he does quote from these proposed rules for women in Dungeons and Dragons, and they are horrifyingly sexist, is the only way I can describe them. So, of course, when I was reading that article, I had to share that with every woman I know who plays Dungeons and Dragons, and just enjoying the laughter and the rage that came out of seeing what was, or what almost was, a couple decades ago, and how far it has come since then. Liz, I'm sorry, I don't know if you wanted to answer the last question, or.
No, that space, though, of, like, laughter and rage that comes from these rules. I mean, I think that, people who occupy these spaces feel that so frequently. So it might be like something, I just finished on Monday, the last class for the semester in race and gender. And, students were presenting their final work, and they're talking about the things that they did. And one student was talking about kind of this fitness inspiration culture. Obviously, it was a critique of the culture as it, kind of comes to life on Instagram and in social media. But, you look at these images, you look at those rules, for example, that were cited in Aaron's work, and you just think, like, how ridiculous is this? And yet those things live on, right? And so I'm so grateful for these types of spaces where, we can come in and kind of openly question them, openly critique them, right? And I know, as you talk, Aaron, about that like glass ceiling that exists for those characters, right? They can only go so far, right? They can only move so much. And I wonder if, sometimes those differences, those fundamental differences that are created aren't even questioned because we're so used to seeing those differences in real life, right? And as much as we might discredit that they exist in real life, women can do anything. Yes, but there are these structures in place, right, historically, that have blocked women from certain pathways, the right to vote, right? I mean, so thinking about that, thinking about these built-in kind of stops along the way, I thought was really, really fascinating because I don't know, are people questioning that power, in the more recent versions or earlier versions as well? Is there a question of why this power, stop along the way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this comes to some of the deep. So there might be people in the audience from this field even, but there's a subfield in game studies called role-playing game studies, where there's a lot of actual writing that is around role-playing games. And people have done a lot of thinking and theorizing, both from a design perspective, but also from a sort of critique perspective on what happens in these moments that we role play. And I think one of the things that is often thought about there is this sort of like treadmill of it's like a virtuous cycle almost, where you play, you fight things, you gain a level, you then learn to fight things better and you gain a level. And like when people critique in a feminist context things like empowerment, like the wonderful feminist scholar Sarah Benet Weiser, right, we're thinking about empowerment then in the context of like the actual workforce. But in games, there's a literal cycle of empowerment that's often embedded into the rules, where affectively, emotionally, when you play the game, you're encouraged to just like do more killing because you will gain more levels and you will be better at doing killing, right? Like that's part of the game logic that's kind of put there. And I do think that there is a moment of reckoning of trying to understand what it means to play with power in this way, and what it means for our psyches and our emotional experiences as we try and experience the games this way. I also know that a lot of people are trying to design against that grain right now, because that is not always seen as the ideal way to design a game, but it is for sure the dominant way that games are seen, apprehended, and made at this time.
All right. Thanks. Thank you. I guess we've had a couple questions in the Q&A for a while, so I guess we can switch gears to one of those for a few moments. So Jacob Gordon, name I'm very familiar with, librarian out of Juniata College in central Pennsylvania, has asked, when it comes to playing RPGs like D&D, what tends to be more experientially appealing to you, us the presenters? Is it the chance to tell or experience a story? Is it the opportunities to act or perform for a small group, or is it something else? So I guess cameras on me, I'll go. I mean, I enjoy the storytelling aspect of it. I mean, I'm an English professor, I'm a writer. I like being sort of not only behind the wheel as a DM and being able to craft stories for, characters that react in ways that I could never anticipate as a storyteller. But also as a player, I enjoy being a part of those stories in a very immersive kind of way and seeing somebody else craft a world for me as the player. Because I mean, whether I'm an avid reader, I watch movies, I play video games, I devour stories, and for me, it's just another way to consume stories, I think. And who do I get to be today? Do I get to be, the wizard, a barbarian, a paladin? So, Nicole, did you want to chime in on this? Yeah, go for it.
Dave, mute yourself so I'm not
Yes.
echoing.
You're good.
So I do actually enjoy the storytelling aspect of it, not because of the fact that I do tend to write. So I find it to be a way that I let out my creative juices in a more almost performance, because I also have stage fright. So this gives me a chance to like be in front of all my friends and like come up with this crazy idea of like how I want to play my character and who I want to be, and then basically see how they react. So right now I play a bard, and my friend is trying to convince me to like sing for my bardic inspiration, and I keep telling him no because of the fact that like I'm not confident in myself because of the fact that I have a speech impediment. So that makes me nervous to perform in front of them. So it is interesting to be able to tell that story, because like I'll joke around and say that my bard is having stage fright and all that, to try not to perform for the bardic inspiration. I'll just be like, and I give such and so a bardic inspiration, and like I want them to imagine that I sing this, but I don't actually like sing it. So I feel like going based off of our last question, that it is a power, because it basically convinces you that it is a safe space to be what you couldn't be in like the real world, what you can be in the fantasy world, or test out an idea that you've never known before. So that's what I think.
Nicole, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's so powerful to hear that. And also, as I have a disability, my eyes cross and I can only see out of one at a time. And for such a long time in my life, I felt self-conscious in that way. And definitely growing up, playing Dungeons and Dragons, escaping into these worlds where I could find a character who wasn't me, who could live in another skin. You know, I do think that has something to do with why the game was so special to me growing up, and something that I don't really think enough about. So I think that's really awesome that you can find ways to play with your characters in that way, to navigate these sort of like boundaries of experience and to see what fits for you and what doesn't fit for you in a safe space. So like, thank you so much for sharing that story.
So
yeah, I think.
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to thank the three of you. Just hearing those different like uses and gratifications that you have through this game throughout time, and it sounds like it's changed throughout time as well, right? It gets maybe more nuanced at times, maybe more playful at times, but you know, this is why I think it's so critical that in media studies, for example, that, you know, we're not automatically labeling something as good or bad, right? But more so that there are all of these spaces where even if a game has problematic representation, there's still so much good that can come out of the experience of playing it and living it. And so I'm just feeling really honored to hear your stories and how you've found voice in different ways through some of these characters. Really inspiring, very cool.
And I as the you know, I always had that realization of, you know, I'm the straight white guy. I see my representation everywhere, but at the same time, like, we did so one of the things that we've done as preparation for this was a survey. We put out a questionnaire onto our social media, onto the internet as a whole, to just get people's reactions to D&D. Like, how do you engage with D&D? What are the most appealing parts of it for you? And one of the things that I found very interesting about that was a lot of people from the LGBTQ community talked about how validating it has been for them, and how there multiple people in our survey. We got like almost 300 responses, something like that. Yeah.
I want to say 200, but we also had like a test version.
That's true. Yeah. So we got well over 200 responses, and we had multiple people say that D&D for them was not like a way to not only experiment with a new identity, but sort of a sort of soft coming out. Like, they were able to experiment with a new identity, with new pronouns, with like something that they always thought they wanted to be, but they weren't sure. And even kind of were able to gauge how their friends and acquaintances would react to that. Like, all right, like being able to choose their pronouns, for example. being able to express themselves through their character as like as a proxy, and then basically sort of test the waters before actually like coming out. And there have been articles written about how D&D has this, and other tabletop games have this like really devoted following in the LGBT community, just because it has that sort of fantasy play aspect to it, that aspirational aspect that like, all right, let me see how people react to me doing this in a safe space before I do it for real.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. But I also want to be a little slightly critical there, because as we celebrate this game, because I think we ought to celebrate, and I love that we're celebrating all these great things that Dungeons and Dragons does. I also want to be a little critical because it has not always been, or it's not always just people from a diverse range of positions playing the game. There's also been a lot of people, particularly people in positions of power, designing the game and sharing the game with their friends and fanzines and writing articles about the game, who have been a little less inclusive over time. And I do want to, while we celebrate the game and while we recognize that right now it is acquiring a far more diverse player base, and even probably the past 30 years has had people from a variety of places, test things out and test the waters in the game. That actual played space at the table has been very cis, hetero, white, and straight, right? Where it's not necessarily like one might be fantasizing about these things at the table. They might be acting them through at the table, but the alibi that they have for acting these through at the table is the alibi that this is a sort of like heteronormative, straight space where everybody is as they seem at the table. And no matter what they're doing, right? It's not homosexuality; it's homosociality. It's not you're not being black. You're touring what it might be to be black. And so I think that there's some nuance there to thinking through how the sort of like straight white context of the gaming table gives players an alibi to act out in these variety of ways, which can be very emotionally and importantly spiritually fulfilling for the players doing it in these ways.
Kind of segues nicely into the next question that we have from Michael Finley. Has asked, as a white male who grew up with D&D in the 70s and 80s, I think the original D&D felt empowering to nerdy, shy, wimpy white kids. But it is interesting to see the perspective that it still was idealizing a white, heteronormative, jock, strongman worldview. How much did the nerd versus jock dynamic compete with the overall bias toward white male-centric worldview?
Elizabeth, do you want to start on this one?
I love that question, and I love the person who asked it too. So, for me, I see so much of that still in our culture today, this kind of hyper masculinity that's seen as the ideal and people trying to embody that space, right? And I want to think on it for a minute, if you don't mind, Aaron, if I push it back to you.
Oh, I can just talk on this forever.
Awesome.
I have to make sure I put a sock in my mouth first and let someone else have a chance. So I wrote a very brief article on this called "Deodorizing the Geek Gamer" that I wish more people would read, because it was like such a fun thing to write. So Old Spice, the men's deodorant, made a whole character class for Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm just like so fascinated by this. Because Old Spice does guerrilla ad campaigns all the time, but for me there was a question, right? Like, why does Old Spice, right, like a brand that is all about masculinity and like performing masculinity through one's odor, care about Dungeons and Dragons? Why is this important? And I actually think there's a cultural shift happening from the sort of like geeky gamer of the 70s and 80s and 90s who, we have a stereotype of like hanging out in the basement, maybe a little smelly, the kid you don't want to sit next to on the bus, right? So that's like the stereotypical geek gamer historically. And I think we're moving into a moment right now, right, where geeks are now chic, right? Like the geeks of the 70s, 60s, and 80s are the people who have money in our society right now, the people who have clout in our society right now. And I actually think there's a corporate moment where the corporations are recognizing this and trying to sanitize the sort of image that they used to have of the geek, rehabilitate it in a way so that they can sell stuff to the sort of like sanitized cool geek chic that we have happening in our culture today. So that's half of my answer to that question, which is like, what happened to that? The other half of my answer to that is like, I think about morality and the way conversations about morality have happened on Twitter and a social media ecosystem today versus the way they were in 1980s. And I think the movie Revenge of the Nerds is a perfect case here, because when that movie came out, the nerds were definitely the heroes of the movie and the jocks were definitely the villains. But now you look at culture today and you look at that movie, and of course, like I'm trigger warning, but sexuality, sexual violence, but so cover your ears if you want to hear this, but there's a rape scene in Revenge of the Nerds that one of the nerds does in order to be the hero in the movie. And that's a really concerning moment. And I think that our society is kind of having this moment of reckoning where we're trying to understand and grapple with what it means to be a geek. And is that outsider identity all positive, or has it also brought in some negativity within it? And you can think of like some jocks right now, right? Like people taking a knee at football games to stand up for social justice. And that's a very different context. It's almost a more heroic context than that which we imagine jocks as being. Because in high school, right, as coming from a geek in high school, they were the bullies, they weren't the good guys. But I think that our society is kind of encountering this sort of mass recalibration in how we think about morality, how we think about nerdiness, how we think about power in a variety of ways. And I think it should all give us a lot of pause to reconsider and rethink through how we position ourselves and some of that baggage that we're bringing forward with us, and ask ourselves, is this all good? Are these things all good? Is that outsider geek identity really that valuable? Or was there something about the kinship of outsiderness that was valuable, but there are other things there that were kind of toxic? So I think that's my thought in there. And there's scholarship by like T.L. Taylor, by Anastasia Salter and Bridget Blodgett on toxic geek masculinity that really dives deeper into this question. So you definitely hit on a question that like I just talked for hours about. So I want to give Elizabeth some time because I know that Elizabeth.
Yeah, actually save your recommendations because that's our next question. So I'll let Liz jump in with her answer to this question, then we'll move on to that one.
You know, so, I think we can go to the next one. I'm reading the question. I made the mistake of opening up the question, the live Q&A on the side, and there's so many good questions that I was like looking at those and reading those. But this idea of redefining, you know, this geek chic culture and redefining masculinity overall is something that, I'm just kind of really, I've just been watching. I'm the mother to 3 girls, and they're getting to be teenagers, and in thinking about, you know, the friends that they're spending time with and what they're doing, and just trying to see how it is that kids are defining themselves or redefining themselves today versus what that was like in the 80s or 90s is really fascinating, right? That geek title doesn't really have as much of a negative connotation anymore, right? It's reframed in a way. So I think we can just keep rolling with it. But this is awesome. I can't wait till the next one. I'm already sign me up. I'm already there as an attendee. Go ahead, Nick. What do you have for us?
All right. So our next question is anonymous. It's directed specifically to Aaron. I read your work in the Taylor and Voorhees book, Masculinities in Play. Are there any other voices or scholars you think are having good D&D conversations in academia that a person could look for?
Oh my God! You just asked me that.
So yeah, like I said, you were getting into that with your last answer. So.
Okay, yeah, let's do this. So yes, for sure. There's a lot of really great scholarships on Dungeons and Dragons right now, and mine is not the only scholarship there. For other good scholarship on race in Dungeons and Dragons specifically, I look at Antero Garcia's work. He's a professor at Stanford. We're writing an article together right now. He does really exciting stuff that's ethnographic research on race in Dungeons and Dragons that I highly recommend. For research on disability in Dungeons and Dragons, I have to give a big shout out to my wonderful colleague Shelley Jones, who's another editor at Analog Game Studies, who's written some excellent stuff on disability in Dungeons and Dragons. And also Elsa Sujin Henry, who writes about the experience of disability in Dungeons and Dragons. So she has written many things. She's also, I think, gotten a Hugo Award. She's an amazing writer. I check out her work no matter what. She writes games also. So she does some really wonderful, wonderful stuff there. Continuing, if you want to go into like kind of critiques of Dungeons and Dragons, let's do sexuality in Dungeons and Dragons first, because that one will be a little more straightforward and tied to the critique. My colleague Jaakko Stenros and Tanya C. Hoven both work in Finland, write a lot about sexuality in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's really excellent stuff. And if you want to learn more about masculinity in Dungeons and Dragons, my colleague Stephen Dashiell writes about masculinity in Dungeons and Dragons. He looks at like veterans playing the game, and his work really deserves a lot more attention than it's gotten in the past, because it's so fascinating. So there's just a whole ecosystem of people doing that work. And then you can get into like sort of critiques of fan communities in Dungeons and Dragons, where you have people like Evan Torner, who's been writing about role-playing games for years, and whose research is on alternatives to Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like if you're sick of the mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons and you want to know about the indie scene, look up Evan Torner's work, because he's going to talk about all the stuff that's happened around Dungeons and Dragons the past few years, and how many great alternatives to the game are. Similarly, William White has written a great history of a site called The Forge, which is a great site that does story games and other role-playing experiences that you can look into. And the list just starts there and keeps on going. So what I will do, instead of just continuing to list people and different ways that the scholarship works, I'm going to go over some key publications and just suggest to get those, because I think that's, in some ways, given that this is a libraries panel, probably the best way to go. The site that I edit, Analog Game Studies, is an excellent site to get kind of the lay of the land and find some of these cultural touch points between Dungeons and Dragons and other things. Jose Zegel and Sebastian Dieterting put out a book called The Role-Playing Game Studies Reader about 2 or 3 years ago, and that has a whole resource of people that I didn't even list writing on role-playing games and role-playing game experiences. There is a journal called the International Journal of Role-Playing that is a free online journal that anybody can go to, that always publishes on things like Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. And then here's the craziest part. There is a whole series of books from conferences in the Nordic countries called the Nudepunkt conferences. I'm not even gonna spell it right, but one of the better ones is called Beyond Role and Play. Again, these are edited often by Jaakko Stenros and Marcos Montula, amongst others. And this whole series of books is a literal treasure trove of scholarship on role-playing and role-playing games that really just like spans the gamut of time. So like it goes deep, and it is a rabbit hole if you want to get into it. And there's a lot of really, really great places that you can look into to learn more about scholarship on this topic if you are interested.
So, Aaron, what I might have you do is I may bug you after we're done for a short list.
Okay.
And then we can highlight that like on our library pages, and maybe even look into maybe getting some of that stuff for the library, because obviously there's interest in here, at least here at Cedar Crest, to look into that. So thank you. That sounds like an awesome list to even just to start. It's quite a lot to get through.
Yeah. And I didn't list a lot of other people also, so I would like. It's
always the trouble once you start.
I would like to be more thorough, especially if like somebody watches this after the fact. Like, I'm so sorry I didn't list your thing, because it's awesome work. It just wasn't on the top of my brain. There's only so much space.
So our next question is from Luann Fletcher. So professor here at Cedar Crest. Just want to take this moment. In addition to all the advertising that we've done here at the library, Luann sent out an email to everybody on campus saying, hey, this is awesome, please go watch this. So Luann, thank you for that before I read your question. We really appreciate that. So Luann is wondering if there's a difference between visual and written representations. Is there a greater danger in being nostalgic for one form of representation rather than the other? Are there different psychological ways into a game versus a book?
Oh my gosh, my brilliant colleague. You know, one of the things that it made me think of immediately almost was Nicole's response. And Nicole and Nick, to me, you just froze, but Aaron, I still see you moving. So I'm going to hope that our people can still hear us. It's really windy here, and I live about a minute away from the college, so I'm hoping they are not, without power. But I was thinking about visual and how versus written, and how Nicole talked about getting into the game and playing with identity and thinking about different representations of self. And I wondered if, written gives us a little bit of that space. Is this the reason why when folks read a book and then go to see the movie, they're so angry? Like, they're always angry, right? No one is ever happy for the most part with how a text is made into a movie, because they had a picture of what it was in their own mind. And so maybe there's, something about written work that allows us to put ourselves in that space. I'm not sure.
Can you hear me, Elizabeth? I'm not sure.
I can.
So we had a power outage.
Oh.
I figured.
Nick is currently out, so one moment, because we're going to connect him to my phone temporarily as a hotspot so that he can come back in.
Okay.
No worries. I think the attendees are still here because they're probably off campus, Nicole. So yeah. I say we just keep going while you all connect.
We'll roll with it.
Yeah, you two keep going, and I'll try and switch you as I can. Luckily, it switched you, Liz, when I was doing it.
I became the boss.
We're so fortunate to have Nicole and Nick as moderators. They're doing such an amazing job. So through weathering the storm, so heroic. Yes, I think I'm gonna break it down in the way that game studies scholars have thought about this, because this is definitely something that game studies scholars are really interested in and talk about a lot. So there's two main discourses around this in game studies. One is a conversation around something called procedurality, which are the procedures that one must take to play a game. And then the other is a conversation about values and play. And so both kind of talk about this phenomena, right? Which is like, what does it mean to play a game that is different from doing something like reading a book? And I think I think the people who write about procedurality want to answer that question in a way that kind of says like, well, you learn things through the procedure, right? Like if you memorize a procedure from a manual to do something, there's a sort of embodied learning aspect to it. So one of the examples I know I've seen in a talk on this is like Cold Stone Creamery making a game to teach people to scoop ice cream. One learns from that game in an embodied way that they wouldn't learn from reading the manual of how to scoop the ice cream. You'd have the knowledge in both senses, but not necessarily the experience of scooping or how to balance the scooping in a way. So that's kind of like the procedural approach. The other one, values, and that term is coined by Ian Bogost, who wrote a book called Procedural Rhetoric. The other one, which is values at play, right, which is different than procedural rhetoric or the conversations that might happen around procedures, the rhetoric of it, is by Mary Flanagan and Helen Nissenbaum. And in their argument, one approaches play through a set of values and a set of lenses, and they value certain things while you play. So, right, like one might go into a game because they value that feeling of excitement that they have when they play a game. One might go into a game because they value having friendship. And so it's just a different way of kind of getting at that same phenomena and saying like, okay, well, maybe you're not explicitly learning something from the procedure, or the procedure is not making an explicit argument, but we as people are coming in with a set of values that structure the way we experience the thing and play it. So I think those are the two main conversations that are kind of ways that are looked at in game studies literature, which is one of those rare times where I'm like, yes, I know there's people who talk about this and I can help you get their books to help do some more representational analysis there. But I will say one last thing, which is that one of the reasons that game studies came into being was actually at the time a fairly sexist conversation that was happening between a bunch of male scholars who played games and were kind of poo-pooing the work of a bunch of female literary scholars who saw games as narrative things. And so this very early moment of game studies is a little bit fraught also because it was a bunch of men kind of performing with machismo and saying, well, we know how to analyze games, and it's not by looking at the pictures, ladies. And there's a sort of like fraught moment there that is difficult to unpack because it's important that we've come around from that and we're bringing representation back into the conversation, because obviously by not thinking about representation, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy and kind of one that kept a lot of women from engaging more robustly within the conversations that were happening around games at the time. So that's a little bit of shop talk. So I hope it's not too much. Also, I don't have a list of questions, so that's one thing that I am not seeing if anything is popping up from the audience.
I missed that whole thing.
It was really good, Nick. Trust us.
Yeah, it was perfect.
So the
Really
issue
good.
with the questions is I have to publish them in order for you guys to see it.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Because the power went out, it didn't publish whatever questions came in. So if anyone had questions and it's not
I
published,
still can
please
see them,
resend them.
Nicole. Nicole, I can still see it. How about I ask the question? Should we flip it here?
Well,
Let's
those are
flip
the
it.
ones I published.
Oh, that you
So there's
published.
one-
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know how long do we have on our panel today, Nicole and Nick?
However long this conversation goes, basically.
Forever. All right. So let me go ahead. Do you still see Amy's question there, Nicole? Or did that cut off when you all disconnected?
No, I've transferred that over where it says appreciate the way that Nicole described testing out. So I saw that. I published it before we went out.
Okay, great. So I don't know if we want to ask that now, since we can still see
cannot see that question. I can't see anything in the Q&A feed at the moment. So if one of you guys can see it and wants to read
I
it,
can.
rather
I
than,
can. All right, so let's flip this. All right, I'm asking y'all some questions now. All right, so Amy Faber, who is one of our faculty members, and I feel like I need to say something personal about each person. It's just a good group of people.
I love Amy. I'm going to add that in real quick. Love you, Amy.
This is good. I really like this. So Amy said, I appreciate the way that Nicole described testing out something with your character in a quote unquote safe space. For someone who wishes she knew more about gaming, can you explain to the naive how much control you have over your character's power and skills? And then she puts in, that she grew up in the age of Atari. So she's wondering how much power do you actually have over what exactly you can do. And this was fascinating to me too. And Amy, I think that's such a great question because, there were people who were, we were talking about this, was it the 4th edition, where people had a lot more freedom, a lot more ability to kind of go outside of these traditional constraints, and that really frustrated people, whereas you may have thought it excited people. So that's really fascinating. I was wondering, now with this 5th edition, and I don't know if y'all are picturing a 6th edition coming soon, or if that's something that players are expecting. But yeah, how much power do you really have over your skills?
I should probably clarify because I may have mischaracterized 4th edition there. The way you think it would work is actually the way it did work. Players had less power to make decisions. So not only could they not modify and make their own worlds in 4th edition, but the game itself was very inspired by massively multiplayer online role-playing games like World of Warcraft at the time. And so it was like, instead of more of a story narrative-driven experience, it was very statistically driven, and it was very much about trying to give hard mechanics to resolve encounters with. So it was more of a tactical game in some ways than a role-playing game. And I think that players were actually hitting up against that wall a lot, and that was one of the reasons that they designed in Pathfinder, where they did have this sort of freedom to make their own canvas and write the game however they had wanted.
So I'm not sure who is on screen at the moment. I'm on a hotspot at the moment, and I am kind of lagging, but I think it's me. So Nicole had to step away for a moment. we had a power outage here in the library, so we are dealing with the fallout from that. So I apologize if this is a little wonky for a minute for anybody watching. But yeah, I mean, this is in response to the question of how much freedom do we have, how much agency do we have. Depends. I mean, the rules are there, but especially with 5th edition, I think it depends a lot on the group you're playing with and the DM that you have, because baked into the core of the current edition of 5th edition is, hey, we have rules, but the DM decides what goes at your table. The DM has the power to decide which of these rules they want to follow, which of these rules they want to break, and that sort of aspect of it is, I don't know if encouraged is the right word, but it's certainly not discouraged in the current rule set. The idea of, yeah, we have this rule set, we have these things that we've tested, that we've refined, that make for a quote unquote balanced experience. But if you don't like that, great, do your own thing. We're not going to stop you. I don't know, Aaron, you've been nodding. Is that your impression of 5th edition as well?
I mean, you are very correct about that. I was at a talk with Mike Merles, who was one of the designers once, and I was actually really surprised because when he was talking about the way that he played the game, it was even more. It was like, oh yeah, well, we just level everybody up at the end of every adventure. And the assumption I think that they made with 5th edition was that the rules were there for players to play with, not that the rules were the game. And I think that was actually a really intelligent change of thinking that the designers made when thinking through 5th edition. That was kind of a change from the earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons, where this is like getting into Gary Gygax and the history of Dungeons & Dragons, but like in the 80s, at one point, Gary Gygax created a column in Dragon Magazine called Sage Advice, and the explicit purpose of this column was the sage, Gary Gygax, resolving rules disputes between players of the game. So like there was kind of like a sort of patriarchal way that the game used to be understood, where there was a right way to interpret the rules versus a wrong way by some fans. And at this point, I think the designers have gotten wise to the fact that the fans are going to play the game they want to play. And that's actually that's a feature, not a bug. And they're trying to design that into the game in a variety of really clever ways. So, yeah.
I still have no visual on the Q&A stuff, but it's mine. As I said, I'm kind of lagging over here. So if Nicole, are you able to see our questions? One.
Michael Finley just asked one moment, if I sound out of breath, it's because I had to run down to the archives room because the dehumidifier turned off during the power outage, and that's kind of important for our archives room.
Oh my gosh, y'all are the most multitasking people I've ever seen. Oh my gosh.
So Michael Finley asks, have the newer editions allowed more paths for advancement that do not involve killing creatures? If so, what are those mechanics? Do they reflect more passive and or socially positive interactions?
So I can answer that question. They do and they don't. So I think in many of the recent editions of Dungeons & Dragons, experience is often awarded based on monster kills or sometimes puzzle solving. Now you see in some of the newer editions, like in modules, they'll offer scripted ways to gain experience, like if you clear a room or something like that. But often player groups that don't want to award experience or don't want to award fighting the same kind of clout as other kinds of experience will just level characters up without doing the thing. And I know several friends who will just play Dungeons & Dragons like as a murder mystery game or a different genre game that allows for storytelling, where they kind of look at the rules as more of a world than a set of rules that they have to follow. And so to some extent that is being picked up by designers. Like I know in the game Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which is like this sort of like rules adventure book for Forgotten Realms Waterdeep City, there's lots of things that characters can do besides fighting to earn experience. But the problem actually isn't in what you can do. The problem is what you gain by earning experience, because what you gain by earning experience 9 times out of 10 are combat mechanics. And so from a design standpoint, the loop of engagement that the player gets caught in Dungeons and Dragons is, oh, I need to go fight and kill monsters. These monsters are tough, but I killed them. Oh, great, I got a level up, and so now I can buy better upgrades to kill characters. And so there's a whole incentive built into the game to keep players' attention focused on kind of combat mechanics in the game. And I think that that's part of the reason that, for the most part, Dungeons and Dragons continues to be a hack and slash game.
Yeah, and to sort of add to that, I know the rule set that I've played a lot with is what they call the milestone achievement, which is basically when your DM decides you've done enough, they give you another level, and that can be as a result of I've had DMs who are like, hey, you guys spent like 3 sessions in a city, you help people out, you solve problems, you get to do this. I had one DM who literally wrote an entire like play for the players to act. We had to roll, for not only how well we did, but in person he made us recite these lines as our characters playing other characters, and at the end of that whole thing it was, okay, hey, you guys get a level up now. But to your point, Aaron, like, yeah, the point of leveling up is that you're better at killing the monsters.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it is, like you said, it plays in, no matter how much you tweak it, no matter how much your DM decides to reframe it, the core spirit of the game is still that, like, high fantasy, go on a quest, slay the dragon, etc. But do we have any more questions, or is anybody going to add anything to that? I feel kind of blind over here. Our internet on campus is actually down at the moment, so we are on a hotspot.
This is like so
if it looks a little rough and it randomly jumps between different speakers who aren't actually speaking, I do apologize.
So we don't have any more questions, but we did have someone who left because they had to go to their show. So I told them to just drop me an email. That way I can send them the recording as well as the resources we used today or that Aaron has mentioned today. So Aaron, we will be bothering you after the meeting to send us all those resources so that we can either add to our library and also send out to everyone so they can have.
I would love to share as many things as I can with this, because it's wonderful to see so much enthusiasm around something that I think for a lot of us has just been like the nerdy thing that we did as scholars and that we didn't think a lot of people were that excited about. So I'll be very happy to share other work. And this is just like, I've been so jazzed on this conversation. I don't know if you can tell from my answers, but like I've just enjoyed these questions so much and talking to everybody and having this conversation. So thank you all for having this panel. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, your energy, Aaron, is definitely contagious. And Nick and Nicole, I know I wrote this in an email, but like I want the two of you to arrange every panel I'm ever on ever, because you all were so great at communicating and reaching out and following back up, and that's not the way things normally run. I think it was really fabulous. So do you think I could ask the three of you like a quick last question before we wrap it up, since y'all are really the experts in this area? So I know we're 7 years into version 5. And so I wondered if you were a designer for version 6, what is one element, that you would have, or maybe remove from the play? What would version 6 look like to you? If it could be anything.
That is an amazing question. I think I'll let Nicole and Nicholas answer it first while I think about it a little.
Oh God, that's hard.
I think they're under the bus because I don't know the answer either.
You may have stumped us there, Liz.
No,
I don't have nearly as much experience as Aaron does. I played mostly 5th edition. I played a little bit of 3rd edition, but just the difference between those two is pretty staggering. I know 5th edition is the one that I prefer just because of the freedom and the flexibility and the ability to do to adapt and change. And honestly, I'm not sure because, as I said earlier, built into the rule book is hey, if you don't like the rule book, change it. And it's hard to imagine like where we would go from here. Especially since Wizards of the Coast is doing such a good job listening to feedback and just tweaking things and adding things. Like one of the things that was that I always found kind of challenging was the idea of the limited options for like for your lineage choice, I guess is the new terminology for it. And like, all right, we have these. When 5th edition first came out, I think it was 6 different options that you had. Human, dwarf, elf. This pretty standard fare for fantasy, and then they've slowly added all of these others. And in a supplement that came out just a couple months ago, the first chapter is like, hey, you don't like anything that we have? Great. Here are literally the rules to make your own creature. Whatever you want to play, even if we don't have a rule set for it, here are tools that you can use to build your own thing. And I think that kind of their Wizards is giving us the tools to make that better version. Whatever we want, whatever we're not getting, they're slowly giving us these pieces to be like, all right, these are the building blocks that we've used. Let's see what you do with them. Just my takeaway from it. I guess Nicole, Aaron, you guys want to answer the question?
Yeah, I have an answer about to get up for a second to get a prop, so I'll be right back.
Oh my gosh, props. I didn't bring a prop. Oh, I'm feeling bummed out now.
I'm sorry, we didn't brief you about that in the email, that there was going to be a visual aid portion.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so 6th edition D&D, this is what we need. 5th edition done the right thing. They brought back Forgotten Realms, which is their generic fantasy setting, and I think it's a little bit boring. And so we need Dragonlance to come back, which was the other generic fantasy setting that Dungeons and Dragons had, because they had 2, and this was the one that I liked more. So I want Dragonlance to be the setting that 6th edition Dungeons and Dragons is part of. It was so cool. It was like the coolest setting ever. The characters were really interesting, and the books, there was like a bunch of New York Times bestsellers in the Dragonlance series, and I read them all so voraciously as a kid. So like, in terms of like the setting that will get me going, I want more Dragonlance content. And I've looked, there's some fan mods that recreate something like the Dragonlance world, or like use 5th edition rules to rewrite the old setting, but I want new Dragonlance content. I want to see how that world is developing. So I'm that fan who's like on the hook and is like, you canceled my favorite part of the series. Bring those characters back. What's happening with Tannis Half-Elven and Raceland? I need to know. So, and yeah, if you haven't read the Dragonlance Dragons of series, which is the series that I think spawned the setting. It was a Dungeons and Dragons game that spawned a book series that then spawned a setting for publication. I recommend it. They don't hold up very well. They're actually very poor in light of like the standards of literature today, but like I am very nostalgic for them. So I'll just be a fan, say, just put that out and I'll geek out over it and and play it.
So if anybody at Wizards is listening, there's your next supplement.
Exactly.
Nicole?
So I guess it's my turn, and actually mine goes in line with what Nick and Aaron have already mentioned, but mine is a little different. So I kind of want them to make the supplement where it teaches you how to create your own adventure without having to use like outside sources. Because sometimes it's not right or it doesn't line up with what you want. Like, I was trying to make a campaign for the anime club on campus, and I couldn't find anything anime themed to create this campaign. And I was kind of sad. I was like, how do I do this? And I couldn't figure out how to make it myself. So I kind of wish they would create ones that was outside the realm of fantasy, but still within it, if that makes sense. So where it includes cartoons or animes or things like that. Like, I follow a Facebook group and someone mentioned the fact that they did a Final Fantasy campaign. And I was like, how? So.
This is a question, but have you seen the Dungeon Masters Guild, Nicole?
I have, and I actually looked into all of that, and then I was remembering I'm poor.
Yeah, it is a lot of money to buy that stuff. But yeah, I see the most creative settings happening in the Dungeon Master Guild, which is a fan space where fans submit stuff, and then it gets accredited by Wizards of the Coast and goes to publication. So I'd keep an eye on that space, because it might be that the setting of your dreams lies somewhere in that collection.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for even though you say the Forgotten Realms is boring, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons like 3 years ago, and like I'm excited to play a fairy that isn't homebrew.
Yeah.
So that was my first character. I played a fairy that was like 2 inches large and basically turned invisible and then smacked people.
That's awesome.
So I actually have one final question that I think we can end on. Thank you guys so much for joining us. But amid all of this conversation that we've had about not only how gaming has changed and inclusion and the rocky history that it's had, but like as players, as consumers of this stuff, as people who maybe don't have the power to design things for these companies, what can we do as players to help make this a more inclusive, more representative, more enlightened space?
And let's open that up to media too, because Liz is an expert in media. So this can go in line with that question as well. How can we display ourselves and help with media or video games or whatever that portrays different type of people in a correct way?
That's a brilliant question. That's at like the crux of, what media literacy is all about, because it's not just to protect people from media representations, but really to empower them. At the college, we started a program in new media because there were so few women entering that discipline. And obviously there's lots of reasons that combine for that, right? But we thought, how is it that we prepare folks to go out there and actually change the narrative? Right. So if there are more women at the table, if there are more people of color at the table, if there's more LGBTQ plus folks at the table, right, outside of all the norm that we typically had seen, right, the cis white het men, right, if we can change who's in the room, we start to change that story. But even as just a player, right, I mean, you can think about how you create your characters. You can think about how you show up in that space. Something really simple. I don't know who mentioned pronouns earlier, right? But thinking about your pronouns when you're in that space and respecting the pronouns of the other characters, right? If you're, if your dungeon master, is kind and works to kind of find spaces where people are being problematic and roots that out and doesn't promote those people, right? Like, when you are the leader of a game or a player in your game, you have control over that space as well. And so there's lots of small things I think we can do kind of on the everyday, but I'd also really love to see more people in that space when it comes to creating, and also allies, right? So players in these online spaces that will say, hey, cut that out, you're being a jerk, right? I mean, calling people out and holding people accountable is such a small thing that we can do every day, no matter what space we're in, but it can have a big impact. So lots of small things and lots of big things, and hopefully just getting more people to the table. Awesome question, though. Awesome question.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question to end on also. And I feel like Elizabeth did the heavy lifting because that is the correct answer to the question. And I'll just do the light work and say, like, okay, in addition to the stuff that you can read, there's lots of really great BIPOC game designers out there, and you can buy their stuff. And so go buy their stuff. So and they're not always designing with Dungeons and Dragons, but they are designing some really amazing role-playing games. So a great place to learn about this work that's going on is there's a newsletter that you can sign up for on Patreon called More Seats at the Table. It's by a game designer and sort of like community organizer named Misha Bushjager. They're amazing, and their newsletter gets so much information out there that's super amazing. I think Nicholas brought this up, but the upcoming Ravenloft supplement for Dungeons and Dragons, I know has had a focus on diverse design team. It's one of the first that Wizards has put out with a deliberately diverse design team. So that one's going to be very exciting to see. Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk series, believe it or not, is one of the very first role-playing games by a Black designer. So that's a game that you can check out. And he was a heavy consultant even on the video game, Cyberpunk 2077, which was a little bit of a train wreck through the industry, but you can support him by looking at the role-playing game, which is super exciting. There's an excellent game called Harlem Unbound, which is a sort of reimagining of the sort of like Cthulhu mythos through the Harlem Renaissance. That's by a Black designer. So if you were looking for games like this, they're out there. So just seek them out and play them. And I think that's a really clear and important way that you can make a difference in sharing the sort of work of diverse designers. Is find diverse designers and try to, in addition to Dungeons and Dragons, have that game night. My wife runs Game of the Month Club, and we just play a different game every month, and we'll see what it's like, and we'll have a good time. So play those other games. It's like reading other books, read diverse literature, play diverse games. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I keep wanting to jot everything down. Can't keep up with all the recommendations, but that's awesome. Thank you, Aaron. So I think I think that'll do it for us. Thank you guys, Aaron. Liz. Thank you guys for joining us. This has been awesome. Our audience out there, thank you guys so much for all your questions. Sorry if we lost half of them. Thank you guys for bearing with us as we lost power and internet here in the library. This has been awesome. I think this was a great note to start. Hopefully what is the first in many series here at discussions here at the library. Thank you all again.
Thank you all for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Yes, excellent job. I can't wait. I want us to have game night too. We're going to copy off of Aaron's family and have game night and keep going with the great stuff that y'all are doing to really make the library a space where everybody feels like they don't have to go, but that they really want to go there and be there. And you guys are doing a great job. So keep it up. Congrats.
Yeah. Thank you all for such a wonderful panel. And yeah, send me any questions you have. And if you're in the audience, you can follow me on Twitter. It's Aaron Tram. You can find me on the web. It's aarontrammell.com. 2 A's, 2 M's, and 2 L's. It's confusing. And you can send me emails at trammell@uci.edu if you have any questions or follow up. I'm very happy to always chat with anybody who's interested. So looking forward to this conversation moving forward. And yeah, I wish I could be there actually visiting. And hopefully next time I'm near Allentown, I will be. I'll just come by and be like, hey guys, you remember me? So
that would be awesome.
Be happy to have you.
All right.
You're always welcome. And also to the audience, don't worry if you missed any of the information. We will try and get everything together on one sheet and send that out. If you are not part of the campus community, follow our Facebook and Instagram, because I'll make sure to put it on there as well.
Those of you that are not, even if you're not on social media, if you go to the Cressman Library website, you can find my email, Nicole's email. Feel free to reach out to either of us. We're happy to talk about this stuff.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.
See you all later.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.